Phospholipids are very similar to triglycerides. They're going to have a fatty acid tail. Instead of a glycerol, they're going to have a phosphate at the top. And when we look at these, the fatty acids we know are hydrophobic. They don't like water. But the phosphate heads are actually going to be hydrophilic because it's PO4 minus. Okay, this O is going to love to hang out with hydrogen. When we look at these guys, every single membrane that surrounds your cells are made up of phospholipids. Structurally, they're very similar to fats, to the triglycerides we just looked at. They are fats. They're fatty acid tails. They make up cell membranes. And when we look at them, we're going to see 2 fatty acid tails instead of the 3 that we saw in triglycerides, and we're going to see a phosphate. So that's where the phospho comes from. So here they are. Looks very similar to the triglyceride, right? Not a whole lot different. It's got 2 tails instead of 1. It always has a kink in the tail. This will be important later on. And this big old phosphate up at the top, hydrophilic like crazy. It loves water. Hydrophobic, hates water. And when we build a membrane, we're going to build something known as a phospholipid bilayer. Bi meaning 2. So you see, here's one set of phospholipids. Here's a second set of phospholipids. So why do they form a bilayer? Why are these tails pointed to this inside, all mushing together? They're avoiding the water. There's water inside your cells. There's water outside your cells. The tails hate water. The only way they can get away from that water is to actually hang out in the middle. So they push themselves to the middle. The hydrophilic heads go to the outside, enter in contact with the water. Everybody's happy. So when we look at your cells, this is just a small piece, but you have to envision that this goes all the way around your cell and forms this layer. This layer is going to be critical for us when we talk about things moving in and out of your cell. It's actually going to help us regulate things moving in and out. We're going to talk about diffusion, things moving across the membrane. We're going to talk about osmosis, moving water across the membrane. All of these things will be important for helping your cells do their job and regulating what's moving in and out. Now, these cell membranes, as I mentioned, have a kink in their tail, so they have an unsaturated tail. This essentially is going to leave gaps for us and allow those membranes to be a little more flexible. They're not going to pack together tightly because they're unsaturated, so they're not going to pack together very tightly. It turns out that if you actually can increase the number of double bonds, so if you increase the unsaturation of those tails, we're actually going to look at having that membrane be even more flexible. And when we look at things like this fish that are in very cold waters, it does amazing things to keep those membranes of those cells flexible. Because what happens if you put oil in the freezer? Well, it freezes into a solid, right? So if you put fatty membranes around cells and then put this fish in water that's near freezing, some of those membranes would freeze if they didn't have these unsaturated tails. So we'll look at a lot of these differences and how these small changes can make huge effects for the organisms. When we look at steroids, we talked briefly about estrogen and testosterone already, but they also include cholesterol, vitamins. They're a 4-ring structure, okay? So when we look at our steroids, that LDL versus HDL comes back again when we talk about cholesterol. But we also look at steroids and HDL as being a very common component in cell membranes. We talked about that. You need to keep that in mind when we talk about cells. And when we look at steroids, this is essentially the building block for many hormones and vitamins inside you. So this is basic cholesterol. This is the steroid. So all we do is add functional groups to change what that steroid is going to do. Here are 4 different steroids: cholesterol, vitamin D, testosterone, and cortisol. They all have the same steroid structure, and all we've changed are the functional groups. Very small changes, but your body recognizes those changes, and it's very, very important. Now, most of you only think about steroids, I suppose, associated with bodybuilding and so on, and we know that a buildup of steroids in the system can actually have some pretty serious consequences because your body doesn't know what to do with all of it. So all of these things, liver damage, depression, high cholesterol, well, it's a steroid. High blood pressure, all of these things are associated with overuse and abuse of steroids.